Barry Goldwater was one of the most unpopular Republican presidential nominees in history. At the height of New Deal prosperity, when the United States was essentially a kind of social democracy, Goldwater was a libertarian capitalist. A strict constitutionalist, he thought the Civil Rights Act infringed on states' rights, and although he was a desegregationist in his home state of Arizona, he opposed the act federally. Goldwater only managed to get the Republican nomination thanks to a split within the party's flanks, and denounced as a bigoted right-wing dingbat. He was crushed in a landslide by Lyndon Johnson in the 1964 election. Johnson used the slogan, "In your guts, you know he's nuts." It thus might surprise you to learn that Goldwater was pro-choice. In fact, he was the vice president of his local Planned Parenthood. Abortion was both a common practice and a personal decision to be made between a woman and her doctor. The big government that he railed against had no place butting its nose in the wombs of women. Goldwater was hardly fringe in this belief. His friend and protege, Ronald Reagan, wrote a law liberalizing therapeutic abortions as governor of California in 1967, and did so at behest of his fellow GOP members, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and at the time George H.W. Bush, who was nicknamed Rubbers because of his advocacy for Planned Parenthood. All espoused pro-choice sentiments, and it was a conservative Supreme Court that passed Roe V Wade in 1973. A 1972 Gallup poll found that 68% of Republicans considered abortion to be a private matter, not a governmental one. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, however, strange new paths began to converge. Socially evangelical organization was growing, with Pat Robertson building the Christian Coalition and televangelist Jerry Falwell founding the private Liberty University in 1971, whose graduates went on to fill the White House staffs of Republican presidents. In addition to bolstering entrenched support, the fundamentalist right became a gathering place for the remnants of the recently powerful but now unspeakable supremacist groups, the KKK, neo-Nazis, and America Firsters. Then entered a famous napkin. In 1974, right-wing economist Art Laffer sat down with two young up-and-comers in the Republican Party, Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. On a cloth napkin, Laffer sketched a rough graph, his infamous Laffer curve, showing that by cutting taxes on the rich, one could theoretically increase economic activity and ultimately bring in just as much or even more in total taxes. While it's iffy as to whether this can work in practice, this would swiftly become the new Republican economic policy. Throughout the 1970s, these varied paths linked together to form an authoritarian triangle of evil: corporate funders, evangelical organizers, and Republican politicians now formed a new right. Strategically, the goal was to expand the Republican base by giving evangelicals newfound influence over social policy. Economically, the goal was to consolidate power, break the New Deal, and give corporations free rein. Leading Republican voices, including Reagan and Bush, quickly reversed their tune on abortion. Reagan repented his sins, while Bush simply said, "Don't nickel and dime me on the details." In 1980, social scientist Bertrand Gross released Friendly Fascism, a book about the consolidation of right-wing economic and governmental powers without the crematoria of Mussolini and Hitler. That same year, the Reagan-Bush ticket was elected to the U.S. presidency. The aftermath was significant. The entire political spectrum was swung way to the right. Republicans produced an array of new right candidates that looked increasingly insane from the outside. Mike Huckabee, Michelle Bachmann, Herman Cain, Rick Santorum, Rick Perry, Newt Gingrich, Sarah Palin, Ted Cruz, etc., culminating in the bizarre White House of Donald Trump, backed by Jerry Falwell Jr. Defeated Democrats felt the need to fundraise like Republicans and quickly made themselves beholden to the same economic interests, ushering in 4 neoliberal decades, which are now continuing to count. Republican Ron Paul, meanwhile, was furious that Reagan, through deficit spending and Laffer curve economics, maintained a big government oriented towards an imperialist military. Paul briefly defected as the Libertarian Party candidate before returning to the Republicans as a reformer, where he is considered the godfather of the Tea Party. Perhaps the most telling development was the standing of Barry Goldwater. The same constitutionalism that made him the party's right-wing dingbat now made him the party's flaming liberal enemy. Goldwater, who remained a senator until 1987, was an outspoken opponent of this sudden convergence of church and state, state and corporation, corporation and church. This wasn't conservative. It was socially, politically, and economically authoritarian. Goldwater became increasingly vocal in his stance that abortion was a personal issue, and to the rage of the new Republican establishment said every good Christian ought to kick Jerry Falwell in the ass. He likewise proceeded to support gays in the military and the legalization of medical marijuana, causing further Republican nightmares. In an interview a few years before his death, Goldwater declared, "When you say radical right today, I think of these money-making ventures by fellows like Pat Robertson and others who are trying to take the Republican Party and make a religious organization out of it. If that ever happens, kiss politics goodbye." We are witnessing a vicious war on women. That alone should summon everyone to resistance. Unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. The authoritarian power plays behind this movement constitute a giant war on all fronts of society. They're coming for us all. Don't let the bastards grind you down.